Oh, okay. Oh, I'm drinking Charmander's brain juice. Taliesin, I sing perfect meter, which will last to the end of the world, followed by a list of many details of life. I guess some of the time, because this is all based on or from a Welsh poem from the 1300s that Andrew and Ben overheard someone they knew reciting. That's a professor, and they were like, "Damn, this thing's baller." I made it the lyrics of Loss of Life Part 2, cheekily leading the aforementioned title of the album, Loss of Life, which Part 1 then caps the album in what I imagine is a full circle back to the start, in this case, to the top of the album. Something that I've always appreciated in a lot of music, and in one album in particular that I've talked about on this channel before, The Void's Tyranny. Um, it's a fun motif to express the theme, and especially of this album, a sense of like revitalization through grief. Um, in many ways, the cliched phoenix that only can exist from its own destruction. I love this album, and I've always loved MGMT. I've had a bit of a parasocial attachment to Andrew and Ben, not to the degree where I try to wear their clothes, to eat what they have for breakfast, or to try and figure out how they can be my friends. They're not my friends. They are artists that I greatly appreciate because I became attached to their music at the right time in my life as they were actively navigating the same waters that I was just trying to understand at my age. Because my exposure with them started with Oracular Spectacular, as many people's exposure to them have as well. I always loved Kids because when I was younger, the quirkiness of the video and all the little monsters and even like that little kind of societal commentary inside of the song, along with others like Time to Pretend or The Youth or Weekend Wars. There was something underneath that facade of just pop of that era, electro pop, I guess. I never liked Electric Feel though. I detest that song. I hate that song. I imagine that's probably one of the things I have most in common with Andrew and Ben, because for some reason that's their most popular song. And you listen to the discography of MGMT, you can clearly see they moved so far away from that song. And from that irony, too, from existing inside of their own caricature. And in many ways, that's what I took away from their sophomore record, Congratulations. That album is devoted to inspiration, to trying to become something artistically and articulating some of the internal battles that especially comes from guys in a unique situation like they were, where they were in college making dumb beats, then they actually got a record deal off of songs that they thought were funny, and they didn't want to just be funny music guys. They wanted to make music. They wanted to make something that expressed something deeper than just ha 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 ha. Though they never lost that sense of humor. If anything, it's just become more refined and matured as they themselves have grown up. You especially hear that inside of the third record, their self-titled album, where I think they really learned how to master, maybe pun intended, I don't know, but there's a lot of play with soundscapes on that record, though a lot of it kind of compressed and maybe sounding somewhat cheap. They deviated greatly from the more simplistic groove and instrumentation on Congratulations, though it has some it has some grandiose sounds in like Siberian Breaks or I Found a Whistle, just those atmospheric tunes. Lady Dada's Nightmare especially encapsulates that. But on their self-titled record, you have songs like Alien Days, where they're really just trying to blend so many things together. Mystery Disease especially does that. Cool Song Number 2 does that to an extent. And then they have some other songs like I Love You to Death, I think it's An Orphan of Misfortune, or An Orphan of Fortune. It's one of the two. They're all these songs that are them and their main mixer Dave Friedman trying to create more complex sounds inside of their music. But through all of this, there is an incredible self-awareness that for sure Andrew has, given that he is the singer and the lyricist. But even Ben shares a lot of those same perspectives, despite him being the more kind of quiet musician of the two, though they're both incredibly reserved. Little Dark Age, then, in the context of the rest of their music, it was the turning point. Some people disagreed with me on this for whatever reason, but when I listened to Little Dark Age, it had this incredible feeling of transition for both Andrew and Ben. And the unfortunate thing is they had to deal with people who only on a surface level still follow their artistic trajectory and what it is they're doing, what it is they're meditating about. I think of the one Vice piece that they were interviewed for ahead of Little Dark Age, where it was painting Andrew and Ben just as tricksters.
I think this common idea around your band is you made some just absolute bangers in the first record and then hated everybody who liked those songs.
I don't know, we don't want to be seen as that. I think that the second album that we made was like definitely in some ways a reaction to the quick buzz from our first album, but it wasn't trying to like sabotage our careers.
And they are tricksters, but they're also incredibly thoughtful musicians who have a firm grasp of how to translate something sonically into this thing that is parallel to the emotions that they're trying to express with their words. They're able to amplify their point so smoothly through each mechanism of music production. And all of this is especially important when looking at their latest album, Loss of Life. In many ways, that record is a continuation of not only this incredibly clear artistic voice that Andrew and Ben have been able to curate, but also a linear progression between their records. Little Dark Age has loads of songs that are focused on death and dying. I mean, Little Dark Age itself, the music video is encrypted inside of this whole gothic aesthetic that correlates with the whole idea of A Little Dark Age. And that song, Andrew at least has been on record about saying that it was heavily inspired after the 2016 election, a moment that I know for a lot of people who weren't inside of the Trump sycophantry was tough to grapple with, because you have this perception that history moves forward and that truth and justice is always where culture leads. But that moment was a reminder that culture only leans towards justice through road bumps and turns, and ultimately is not as smooth as the narrative you're able to take from a book, which filters all of the mess into something tidy and interpretable. Of course, after Little Dark Age on that album is When You Die, a song that they co-wrote with Ariel Pink that again carries over that same layering of sound that they were able to work through on their self-titled record, just with a bit more polish is probably the right word. A lot of things just sound so smooth, both vocally and instrumentally, on that song and on many other songs on the record. Even one like James, which is just this synth. It's basically just a synth song. It has this same tone that pretty much drones through the entirety of the song, as Andrew, who has to sing it at a low register because he was screaming too much the night before, is just singing this heartfelt song about one of his bandmates. That entire album has similar undertones to Loss of Life, just in the idea of looking at death and looking at something ending and trying to find anything good inside of this weird area. There's really no other way to describe the discomfort. It's a feeling that people have been extrapolating and conjecturing about since, the beginning of time. Little Dark Age 2 also marked the end for MGMT in some ways, and this is where people disagreed with me until I was proven right. You listen through that record and you get to the very last song after you get through One Thing Left to Try, which itself is this attempt to try and courageously break through as this song that's like a proclamation of trying to reclaim your own destiny and self, in spite of you having no control over whether it materializes or continues, i.e., whether you live or die. You get to the song Hand It Over, which was their third single that released before the full LP came out. So it was their last single that came out with it. And Hand It Over is a concession. When you look at the song and you look at the entirety of MGMT's artistic journey, from being shot to the top of the charts and into the stratosphere of culture, to then realizing they wanted to not be stuck and labeled under the veil that they had created as college kids. And that pivot not necessarily being appreciated by the masses that shot them to the top to begin with. Little Dark Age, then, is this transition where they quite literally hand it over. Not only are they saying, we are not going to go back to this thing that we've been doing. As a matter of fact, we have a different journey to go on. We're going to hand that responsibility of creating that type of market pop and that type of earworm music, whether it has any depth to it or not, to other people to take care of. And coincidentally, they also were done with Columbia, their main record company. Little Dark Age fulfilled their 4-record contract that they started with when they got signed on for Oracular Spectacular. And there's no record of them really expressing much complication with Columbia in that polite PR kind of way. They've always said that there were somewhat hostile undertones to whenever they would make a song, just because they were trying to do things that were more artistically authentic. And sometimes that meant they weren't as digestible over something like the radio. And that frustrated a corporation like Columbia, who pays all this money to these artists to make music that will make money. And MGMT does not care about money. They want to make good music. That's very clear off their sophomore record. It's very clear on the path that they've been on ever since they became these festival darlings. And so on the tail of Little Dark Age and of them leaving the industry to a degree, we of course have the pandemic hiatus that many people were forced into. But then through that, they create Loss of Life under their from their own production label. And they just license it through a different distributor, Mom and Pop. But of course, before then, they had like some other songs that didn't make Little Dark Age, like In the Afternoon and As You Move Through the World. Those were just released as singles after Little Dark Age came out. But Loss of Life is the older brother to Little Dark Age when you listen through it. From that sense of things ending and of things dying, especially on the path MGMT had been on, from being all the way at the top to slowly becoming more and more obscure as they're also trying to become these greater artists and trying to make music that feels more compelling than what you're restricted to inside of the pop space. They have risen from their own death in that way with this record, and that's what this record encapsulates a lot of. The first song, Loss of Life Part 2, uses that Welsh poem as a metaphor for looking at the world. The entire thing is about this little boy who, for some reason, in my mind, feels noble with a name like Taliesin, being told by a presumably older, more experienced person of the things that they've been able to see in the world through travel. But then you learn at the end of the poem, I am Taliesin. It's him reciting his own experiences. And that poem ends with these lines. I was reaped and placed in an oven. I fell to the ground when I was being roasted, and a hen swallowed me. For 9 nights was I in her crop. The most pivotal lines of this poem in relation to this album. I have been dead. I have been alive. I am Taliesin. That poem establishes this sense of spirit being greater than than what you tangibly are, like your physical being. The same way that, you know, you can look at someone's ideas in this modern age, but they might not be here anymore. They, in a way, are abstractly still with us. And that whole dynamic is what a lot of this album focuses on in the context of these two guys who, in many ways, have been dead, have been alive. Of course, all of that within, you know, the media narrative that we're kind of stuck to in terms of trying to interpret the world. And Mother Nature is the first song on the album to make an allusion to their past. With inside of the first verse, with two of their most popular songs, I put the groceries down on the front lawn and think maybe the children just want recognition. I wrote the fairy tale on a midnight drive, wanting to know if I'm more than alive. Children, of course, obviously, kind of referring to kids. And this here, part of that duality that MGMT has always walked between being this digestible, wide-appealing artist versus falling more into their own interests and niches that they want to nurture and grow and develop because that's what's compelling to them. And of course, later on the album, there's another reference that you can kind of think is also alluded to inside of that first verse bar of Mother Nature, and that's in the song Nothing Changes, the 7th song on the album, where Andrew has a quite literal line where he says, "This is what the birds must have been squawking about right before the dream was ending. And maybe you'd have heard if you'd stop fucking around when it was time to stop pretending." That, I mean, quite literally, is a reference to one of their most popular songs, itself a tongue-in-cheek piece, just kind of mocking what being a musician is supposed to be, and thus also kind of establishing where Andrew and Ben's artistic perspective is. Some people might take it in a literal way, just as a kind of party, have fun kind of thing, in the same way Electric Feel has that vibe for a lot of people. But for Andrew and Ben, they very clearly just were kind of fucking around. And that's always what they've been. They've been little jokesters, but they also want to try and be something more than that. But Mother Nature itself is a song that also meditates on this thing that's ending and on how you break through those types of fears. A lot of that conveyed by the specific lines through the chorus where they go, "Covenant of the heart, you know it's turbulent from the start, and I understand it's not your nature." But then at the very end of the song, "Covenant of the heart, you know what comes right after the dark, but I understand your hesitation." That hesitation, at least for me, I've always felt is akin to something like ego death, which, you know, thankfully is not like real dying, because real dying has consequences, including not being alive anymore. And so, but in trying to break through your ego inside of this metaphor, you have to die in some way. That's quite literally why it's called ego death. The way that you are seeing the world is being challenged, and the only way that you can grow from that and potentially see something in a much greater way is to kill that perspective, kill that feeling, and to understand that this thing that feels so real to you doesn't have to be there. And that you yourself are more powerful than that ego. Or just that fear that keeps trembling you down and oppressing you. It's one of the most important parts of accepting anything. But you don't get to acceptance right off the bat. It's all through this discomfort and hesitation before you get naturally in Mother Nature to the acceptance of moving on to the other side, whether that's quite literal, whether it's metaphorical in the way of ego death, or even in some other type of applicable thing. And this foreboding, this foreboding. I don't think it needs to be described as anything. It's just foreboding. You never hear the word foreboding used in a positive light. It's always for something somber and dark. But Dancing in Babylon, just in the title alone, already gives you this illustration of what the song is trying to entail, and on top of that, how it contributes to this idea of loss of life, and even feels resonant inside of this time we're in now, where many people feel like the world is falling apart. For some people, more on the right wing, they assign a lot of that to migrants and immigrants unfairly. But it's just the narrative that they're being fed. And then, on the left side of the spectrum, you see the systemic inequalities and inefficiencies that perpetuate this type of misery and discomfort, and in all of that on both sides of the spectrum, there does not feel to be any progress, any attempt at change, any attempt at action to try and resolve this strain that's being put on, the normal person. It's a real common feeling to see the world in trouble and not have this feeling that it's going to get better. But of course, Babylon, this famed myth and history that of a place that is in ruin, but in dancing through it, you're almost doing that Camus rebellion that he talks about in the myth of Sisyphus, which does come up later in this album, believe it or not. But that whole song is trying to find joy in misery and in destruction, quite literally just trying to dance through the end, trying to do the paradoxical thing, or the antithetical thing, I should say, to where you are at. Then the song People in the Streets, I feel, is another two-parter. In the same way that Loss of Life is two parts on this album, if you listen to People in the Streets and you listen to Nothing Changes, instrumentally they share so many motifs that it feels like they're supposed to be connected to some degree. People in the Streets, a song focused on just change through protest and of people being pushed to try and make themselves heard, and the relationships between that type of struggle and how it's perceived or how it forms. I think of the one line inside of that song that also kind of illustrates where Andrew and Ben are in the context of them as artists in society, where they're marching to the beat of a different drum, going over receipts with a magnifier. The people in the streets aren't singing along because they're probably sick and they're probably tired. I listen for the sound of the starting gun, but when you're living the dream and your ears are bad, the people in the streets aren't part of the fun. And that there just kind of illustrates one of the relationships between people trying to fight for themselves, and then also, the people who might be beyond those struggles in good means, or maybe even an aristocracy, how they don't have a grasp on how these people could have any type of issue. And this type of relationship became especially relevant culturally in America, through the George Floyd protests with BLM, even now with Palestine, and the Americans' continuous funding of Israel, and the conflict between people who are fighting for what's right and people who think they're fighting for what's right. If both people think they're fighting for the right thing, very clearly they have to be in different positions in order to have that sort of framework to stand on. In many ways, people who are much better off will think that they they know better in a lot of ways than people who might not be, but that's not necessarily true. And I feel like the song "People in the Streets" illustrates that, and also illustrates a modesty in that when you are someone who might be able to sit above struggle, you still should be open-minded to what other people are going through. If you're living the dream and your ears are bad, then who are you to have the absolute stance? Who are you to make claim that you are on the right side? That's not something that you can do without consideration of what is being said, what is being presented, or what is being demanded. People in the Streets we'll get to the second part of that song, which is "Nothing Changes" in my mind. But then on this record we get to the song "Bubblegum Dog," which is Andrew and Ben being their most playful on the record. I feel like that song is all about just this weird thing that hovers around you and stays with you. And the fun thing about that song specifically is that inside of the MGMT fandom, there was speculation that a song called "Bubblegum Dog" existed when there really never was. And so Andrew and Ben had this fun opportunity to try and play with their own mythology in that way. And so they utilize this thing that is so speculative into a song which itself shows how that speculation just hovers around you and creates these odd feelings and somewhat guides you in some directions, but in other ways misguides you, and how all of that can strain your perspective. In a lot of ways, it's like that thing that sits in the back of your head that you refuse to ever engage with, and it's that very thing that keeps stopping you from growing in any capacity. In a lot of cases inside of this song, it's about just hate and love. This whole album is kind of about how love trumps hate, in the same way that, you can be alive then from death. Love is the life, and death is the hate. But in the chorus of "Bubblegum Dog," they keep echoing, "I felt hate toward the earthly world, but hate is a very strong word, and it's finally catching up with me. The years of plodding on in fear of the bubblegum dog, it's finally catching up with me." And that's a chorus that expresses growth and reflection and introspection of looking at these things that you might hide from or run away from. And in a lot of ways, MGMT has done that with the stuff that was their most popular. They kept wanting to separate themselves from that, but you can't avoid that type of thing in the same way that you make up a song called "Bubblegum Dog" and all your fans are like, "What is this?" And you know it's nothing, that it becomes this other thing that stays with you and you can't shake it off. So then, in some capacity, it's something that you should embrace. In the same way that when you hate something, a lot of times it's personal frustrations that are projected onto a specific thing. And when you can recognize that, you can let go of that hate. But that only comes with growth and maturity. And in a lot of ways, I feel like that's what "Bubblegum Dog" is. "Nothing to Declare" is an interesting song, just in this... It feels similar to me as that song that Julian wrote that he thought was a Scissor Sisters song, "Ask Me Anything." It just feels like a song that's about just being there, trying to do things. That's the best way I can put it. I don't really have too many words, but it's an incredibly pretty song. I think it's one of the more instrumentally interesting, despite its simplicity. And another example of the soundscapes that they've become real good at mixing. There's a punchiness to the acoustic guitars, but there's always this atmospheric sound that's surrounding both the instruments and and Andrew's vocals, which also contribute to that atmosphere as well, with all the reverb and how many tracks they were able to stack on top of it. And it's so clean. It's so clean in comparison to a song like Mystery Disease that very clearly is scrunched down as tightly as they can possibly get it. Nothing changes then as the second part to People in the Streets. You can look at as the frustration that in trying to enact change, you don't see action done by the people who have the capacity to make that change. And part of this comes down to just ultimately control. And this whole song is about a loss of control. The song opens, "This is what the gods must have been talking about when they told me nothing changes. Falling through the Pleiades straight into a cloud, wishing all the stars could save me." This is in a lot of ways a dirge. This is them screaming, even though Andrew is so beautifully singing, about just being out of control and wishing that there was some semblance of destiny, of fate, of any of these intangible things that could guide you through to a point of safety and comfort. But it itself is this odyssey to the Camusian point in the myth of Sisyphus. It comes back, as I said earlier. In the bridge of the song, when the trumpets come in and there's like this slight key change, or it's just a different chord inside of the progression, I don't know. Andrew goes from this lament and despair to saying, "Thrust the dagger into the night, valiant flailing. Don't even worry about where it is you're aiming. Just try something." Sisyphean daily life, intentional use of that word with endless straining. Fortify the curtain walls, but nothing storming. And then the greatest allusion to Camus' myth of Sisyphus, push the boulder off to the side. It's their own interpretation of that rebellion, in which Camus states that you can imagine Sisyphus inside of this endless turmoil of pushing the boulder up the hill and watching it roll down, to imagine him happy inside of that situation, because the human brain always looks at something as restrictive as that punishment as sad and depressing, because there is no end to it. But if you look at what Sisyphus represents as a metaphor, it itself is this encapsulation of struggle and of just what life is. You are never out of the fire. And so, in some capacity, the only route to sanity is in accepting that. It's in Sisyphus, instead of being frustrated that the rest of eternity is going to be doing the same thing over and over again, that he should at least enjoy it. And that song marks that turning point inside of themselves, inside of the record in some ways too, but also is this amplification of that point, that grief is inevitable, but it's not eternal. The only way to shift despair is through joy, through love. And that gets hammered home inside of Loss of Life Part 1 at the end of the record, but we don't get there just yet. Frady's song is interesting because after this turning point of Sisyphean daily life and trying to rebel against that monotony of existence, here's a song that is dedicated to Andrew having his daughter, whose name is Frady. Did I dream before? It felt like I couldn't love anymore. This song itself, too, an encapsulation of being in such a dark place and out of nowhere, in your soaring through space and time, having no control over where you're going whatsoever. Here you are given something that you can only interpret as perfect. It's an experience a lot of people have when they have kids of their own. And this entire song, it's a beautiful, beautiful poem to this child. that also just symbolizes hope and joy and all these things that when we look at kids, we think of. And it's interesting too, considering a song like Kids propelled them so high into notoriety. And here is a song where instead of distancing themselves from that type of pop sound that they grew to hate, here's a song about them having a kid of their own. Instead of creating something ironic, here's something that in a way is pure. And it evokes all of these new feelings of that are entirely antithetical to that start of the career for Andrew and Ben, though I don't really know how attached Ben is to this kid. I Wish I Was Joking then is like this ironic kind of song where it leans more into the despair, but in this almost kind of admitting way of just the world sucks. These things are. I'm getting older. There is an end in sight, and I wish it wasn't true. Like it very much is an acceptance in a lot of ways as well. And then you get to Loss of Life Part 1 at the end of the album. Itself also just such a strong dedication to one of their favorite bands, the Flaming Lips. My God, it sounds so much like a Flaming Lips song. But it's a song that tries to wrap a bow on this entire journey between despair and hope and faith and loss. This here is Taliesin through his life, witnessing these things. You can sail off the edges of the earth, greet the workers of the universe, but still nothing prepares you for loss of life. And that's true. And so this song then puts everything back into the perspective of this dichotomy. You can lose life in many ways that MGMT has. They are no longer these incredible rock stars that they themselves were being parody to. They're trying to be more genuine human beings, and there's a level of ego death that does come with that. And there's a level of just regular death that comes with that as well. And as an artist myself too, you grapple with a lot of that hate and despair, especially when you have a sense of clear vision, because you see the potential in what it is you are devoting yourself to, and then you see others who choose not to do that, and it creates this frustration because it's a duel between artistic purpose and artistic duty. Many people don't think it is the duty of the artist to make money. It's the duty of the artist to try and invoke feeling and emotion and inspiration in other people through their ideas, not to just make a buck because something sounds pretty. And you can only stay stewed inside of that hate for so long until it gets in your own way. I talked a lot about this in my previous video. And so this here is the ultimate Camusian rebellion. It's looking at all of the reasons why you should be sad and why you should be scared and why you should have no hope whatsoever, and offering that chance to just smile and enjoy it and understand that that is what this whole experience is. In losing life, you lived. And the only way you can live is by recognizing that you can lose this life, but it's not something to be scared of. It's not something to be paralyzed by from fear, because then you don't live. Then you don't get to be and become the person that you want to be. And that's always been the journey in my mind for MGMT, from going to these guys who were just making stuff for fun and being kids in their own way, to then really taking themselves seriously and trying to create this more authentic and compelling music based off of their own appreciations and their own interests, for them to contribute to the well of artistry that so many great artists do. and that being their pursuit versus just trying to make money. Of course, you're trying to make money to a certain degree, but it's not the primary incentive. The moment they worked on Congratulations, and especially listening to a song like Congratulations, you can tell that in spite of having everything, it meant nothing to them. It made them more empty than full. And Loss of Life as a record is a life lived through that entire discography, but more appreciated through their time and their growing up and their maturing, while also being some of the more refined and polished sound that they've ever made. It's truly an amazing record and a great contribution not only to their discography and their whole artistic vision, but also just to music, because it really does try some simple but different things and achieves a lot of that atmosphere so strongly. And that's something that Andrew and Ben have always appreciated. You can especially know that just by knowing that on their second record they had an entire song dedicated to a man who was a master of that, who is a master of that, and Brian Eno. But Loss of Life, I have been listening to from top to bottom since it came out. I put it on a lot of car drives, and it evokes these same feelings inside of me, and it makes me incredibly reflective. It does make me sad at times, but it makes me that appreciative sad, that you can look at things that have been bad, or even look at bad things in general, and just have a feeling that they can be better. Because if you don't feel that to begin with, then the whole ordeal of trying to make things better becomes so much more insurmountable, and feeling futile in a lot of ways. And that's not how you enjoy a life. That's not how you live a life. And the unfortunate thing is that there are some people who won't have that opportunity. They're condemned to their own conditions, their own circumstances, and thus, operate inside of a framework that makes it harder for them to reach a point like that and to experience life in that way. But at least for me, and in my own artistic journey, MGMT have been incredibly instrumental, and Loss of Life is just such a dense and thoughtful record, but in my mind only if you look at the context of everything that Andrew and Ben have done.